The sky above the Tharksey Mountains churned, swirling with violet storm clouds layered like bruises across the alien sky. Jagged winds howled through the crystalline ridges, carrying flecks of frozen vapor sharp enough to score stone. Temperatures plunged with lethal speed. Within the scientific outpost dome, crimson lights blinked along evacuation pathways, echoing shrill directives in monotone bursts. Tharksey Command had initiated phase blackout. Evacuate. Isolate. Contain. In Hatchery Sector D, 2 green-scaled hatchlings trembled beneath a metal grate warmed only by residual floor coils. The older of the twins, marginally larger, pressed its head weakly against its sibling's neck. Their breath formed thin ice over the metal, barely visible. Neither had developed a full frost resistance yet. Both were only 2 days out of incubation. No names. No designations. Just 2 minor genetic anomalies logged in the margin of the facility's asset database. Inside the Tharksey Operations Hub, Commander Zeril tapped commands into a biohaptic display. Holographic vitals scrolled. Hatchlings Alpha through Theta evacuated successfully. The 2 anomalies in D sector flagged as non-priority organic waste. He made no objection. Non-viables were not worth the energy expenditure of drone recovery, especially with a Tier 7 ice cyclone approaching. Beneath his gaze, final protocols locked into place. All atmospheric entry points sealed. Power was rerouted to deep thermal cores for Tharksey personnel. The surface was left to freeze. Calculations were clean. Survival probability of remaining surface dwellers, less than 0.4%. In the observation deck above, Morgan Hale monitored the exodus through her tablet, half-frozen fingers darting across screen filters. She wasn't Tharksey. She was human. One of 6 Earth technicians assigned to xenobiological research under a fragile diplomatic exchange. Most of her tasks were confined to data annotation and silent compliance. But as she scanned the hatchery logs, her breath caught. 2 heartbeat patterns remained active, barely. She enlarged the readings. Twin dragons. Green class. Extreme hypothermia. No movement logs in 6 minutes. She radioed downstairs. Sector D has 2 living hatchlings still exposed. Do you copy? The Tharksey dispatcher responded without inflection. Anomalies. Low-grade viability. No extraction authorized. They'll die out there. Statistical outcome accepted. Morgan stared at the frozen feed of the hatchery. The twins were curled together, unmoving. Their scales had dulled from emerald to an ashen olive. Snow gathered at the vents. She pulled up the override codes she wasn't supposed to have. Her hands hesitated only for a second. Deep under the central shelter, heat roared and life went on. The Tharksey sat within shielded laboratories, murmuring in their tonal clicks, indifferent to what they called biological loss factors. They lacked empathy. Evolution had optimized them for function, not care. Morgan threw on her thermal harness, snapped an emergency capsule into her back frame, and keyed the side hatch override. Alarms warbled once, then silenced. The storm hit her instantly, a fist of frozen needles clawing at her faceplate. Her boots crunched through thickening frost as she forced her way toward the hatchery dome. She moved without pause, every breath sharp, lungs burning with the cold. Above, ice lightning crackled across the sky in a silent, electric web. She reached the hatchery wall and pried the manual lock open. Inside, the room was dim, coated in frost. The heat coils had shut down hours ago. The twins were barely distinguishable under a layer of rime. She dropped beside them, unrolling the biocapsule from her back. Her fingers moved with trained speed, unlatch, seal, insulate. The smaller dragon's eye fluttered once, almost closed again. She rubbed its chest, firm and rhythmic, the way she'd been taught for neonatal mammals, even though she knew these weren't mammals. Life didn't care for categories. The other let out a noise, weak, like dry leaves rustling in wind. She pulled them tighter against her chest and triggered the internal heat core. A faint hum vibrated through the capsule. Her HUD flared red, core heat at 15%, dropping. Not today, she muttered, voice hoarse. You are not dying today! The wind screamed louder on her return, mocking her pace, clawing at her joints, trying to rip the capsule from her arms. She lowered her body, shielding the twins, step after agonizing step through knee-high snow. Her limbs shook from cold and effort, but she didn't slow. There was no backup. There was no protocol for this. There was only her. A single human. And two creatures no one else saw as worth saving. When she reached the outer shelter bay, her suit's sensors were blinking red, core temperature critical. But she didn't stop. She kept moving until the door slammed shut behind her and the emergency heat flared to life. The twins whimpered faintly. One lifted its snout and pressed it to her chest. She sank to her knees, breath ragged. Yeah, she whispered. I got you. Let me know when you're ready for Section 2F, or if you'd like a narration version F, suitable for voiceover. The hatchery bay hissed shut behind her. Morgan collapsed to one knee, arms still wrapped tight around the insulated pod. She slid it carefully onto the floor. The capsule's warmth throbbed under her palms, holding just enough heat to keep both hatchlings stabilized. She removed her gloves with clumsy fingers and peeled back a corner of the seal. Steam escaped. Two sets of dim golden eyes blinked at her through fogged plastic. Still alive. She initiated the cradle warmer and carefully transferred them inside. The larger one shifted weakly. The smaller lay motionless, limbs stiff, skin pale under the frost crusting its snout. She checked for breath. Shallow, intermittent. She counted 5 seconds. 6. Still no draw. Then she moved fast, fingers pressed against the small chest, rhythmic compressions. No hesitation. A gasp. A rasping squeal. Its chest lifted. The dragonling choked out a shuddering breath and curled closer to its twin. She didn't speak. There was no one to hear. The silence in her quarters pressed in, only broken by the subtle beeping of monitors as their vitals adjusted. Stable. Weak but rising. Morgan logged her emergency override into the system. She included full biometric proof of why she'd intervened. Then protocol caught up. A sharp knock vibrated against her outer door. Security entered, not in full gear, but with that formal stiffness that only came before reprimands. A Tharxie officer, scaled blue, eyes dark as wet coal, stood in the doorway flanked by a human liaison. You violated quarantine, the liaison said, voice clipped. Directly disobeyed sector orders. Morgan didn't move from her position beside the cradle. They were alive. The directive was clear. Non-viable. Experimental detritus. They were still breathing. That makes them living subjects. The Tharxie officer stepped forward, long neck angled down to regard her. Your sentiment is irrelevant. Emotional bias compromises operational integrity. She locked eyes with him. Then maybe integrity needs to evolve. They stared. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was tense, calculated. The Tharxie processed everything through logic matrices. Insubordination, risk to infrastructure, contamination control. But this didn't fit cleanly into their models. You are confined to quarters until tribunal convenes, the liaison added. Expect removal from Zenobio access. Your authorization levels have been stripped. She nodded once. Not for them, for herself. If they wanted to penalize her for saving lives, let them. They turned and left. Hours passed. She cleaned the frost off the cradle screen, monitored their pulses, adjusted heat dispersal. The larger twin, the one with a longer dorsal spike, began to chirp softly in response to her hand. When she gently tapped the glass, it pressed its head to the point of contact. The smaller one followed shortly after, sluggish but alert. Neither tried to leave the warmth. But both looked directly at her now, eyes clearer. Something in them flickered with recognition. She checked the records again. Neither had been tagged or named. Genetic Class G17, Batch 9X. Born during storm phase. Deemed redundant due to organ instability. She saved the report and deleted the label line. They weren't redundancies. She slept upright that night, boots still on, back braced against the wall. Every few minutes, one of them would shift, and the sensors would ping gently. She never stopped listening. By morning, messages flooded her terminal, most warnings, some accusations. But one stuck out. A private comm from a human technician stationed at a different facility. Saw what you did. Thank you? You weren't wrong. It wasn't public, but it meant something. Others had noticed. Later, an assistant researcher slid a wrapped protein bar under her door. No note. No name. The twins grew stronger each hour. When she unsealed the cradle for feeding, the larger one tried to stand, limbs wobbling. It toppled, hissed, then tried again. The smaller one stayed nestled close, tail wrapped tightly around its sibling. Morgan reached into the chamber with the feeding tube, but the larger dragon nudged her hand before taking it. Gentle. Deliberate. They remembered her warmth. Her voice. Her presence. No programming. No imprinting devices. Just instinct and memory. That meant something, something the Tharksea wouldn't quantify. Her access to the labs was gone, but she didn't need a lab. She needed them alive. Every hour they lived was a defiance against the system that had already written them off. Morgan sat by the cradle and began drafting a report. Not to the tribunal. To Earth. A full account. Medical logs, vitals, surveillance stills, environmental timestamps. Proof that they'd been left knowingly. Proof that she acted when no one else would. Not for glory. For record. The hatchlings curled tighter together as the cradle adjusted to a fresh heat cycle. Their scales gleamed faintly, a healthy green shimmer returning. The larger one yawned. The smaller exhaled a soft rumble. She reached out slowly. Both nuzzled her hand. They were no longer statistics. They were survivors. Let me know when you're ready for Section 3F, or if you'd like a narration-ready script F version of this. The tribunal assembled within a sealed chamber deep below the Tharksea compound. Every light, every tone, every sound was sterile. Morgan stood alone, arms folded behind her back, watching as 3 Tharksea adjudicators interfaced with a central logic core. Her file hovered in projection, violation code, timestamp, unauthorized movement, risk designation, contamination breach. A human diplomat from the Earth liaison unit stood to the side, not speaking. Observing. Powerless. The first adjudicator addressed her. Your actions jeopardized structural safety and violated high-order protocol. Defense? They were alive, she answered evenly. You had the data. You left them to die. Biological variants. Statistically unsalvageable. Preserving them offered no return. They're alive now. That's the return. Your species overvalues emotional response. This impedes operational integrity. Morgan didn't flinch. No. It's what makes us dangerous in the right way. We don't leave our own behind. We don't leave anyone behind. The core buzzed as adjudicators logged internal arguments. No further questions followed. She was dismissed, pending outcome. Back in her restricted quarters, she returned to the cradle. The twins were stronger now. They moved on their own, unsteady but active. The larger one licked the back of her hand while the smaller tracked movement with focused eyes. They chirped softly when she approached. She no longer needed medical graphs to know they were improving. News had begun to circulate quietly across human channels. What happened wasn't official yet, but the story was spreading. A leak, likely intentional. Footage of her carrying them through the storm. Logs of her override. The tribunal summons. It wasn't loud, but it was growing. She received a silent file from an engineer in orbit, replays of human forum threads. Dozens. Hundreds. Phrases repeated again and again. She didn't leave them. We wouldn't either. We can't let them decide what's worth saving. Earth Command couldn't act directly, not yet. The treaty was delicate. But the pressure was building. In the days that followed, Tharksea officials entered only once to reassert bioasset classification. She refused to hand the twins over. Her reasoning was logged again. No longer assets. No longer experiments. They chose me back. The dragon's behavior shifted more each day. The larger one began mimicking her steps when she moved. The smaller mimicked her tone when she whistled softly. No training. No implants. Just recognition. Response. Volition. That changed everything. When external enviro surveys resumed, Tharxie drones recovered 22 hatchling corpses frozen solid in other sectors. All deemed non-viable. None had been given a chance. Morgan submitted this into evidence. Quiet. Factual. One line. Asterisk, you made a choice. So did I. Asterisk. Human scientists began pushing for a full ethics audit across joint planetary programs. The liaison team filed requests for custody transfer, small steps toward reclassification. The tribunal stalled. Meanwhile, the twins gained strength. On the 6th day, the smaller one lifted itself fully and stepped out of the cradle. It hissed once at the lights, then moved toward Morgan, pressing its head against her leg. She knelt slowly. It chirped and curled beside her. The larger one followed, settling against her opposite side. The moment was captured on the room's passive monitor. She sent the footage off-world. Within 12 hours, new messages came through encrypted feeds. Human outposts on 5 colonies had begun coordinated petitions to reassess the Tharxie's ethical framework on life classification. Thousands had signed. Then came the shock. A private message arrived. Not from a liaison. Not from command. From Earth's Civil Broadcast Authority. We want your permission. Your full story. We'll air it. Clean, unedited, with records. No dramatics. Just facts. Let people see what was abandoned. And what wasn't. Morgan stared at the message, the twins asleep beside her. Her reply was simple. Do it. By the next day, every human installation with a receiver had seen the cradle footage. The tribunal summary. The frozen bodies. The hiss of the wind against sealed doors. But most importantly, 2 tiny green dragons curled against one human, surviving in defiance of everything that said they wouldn't. The Tharxie could argue logic. They could deny value. But they couldn't rewrite the proof that life responded when treated like life. Let me know when you're ready for Section 4F, or if you'd prefer a voiceover style version, F, for video production. The media release shifted the balance overnight. Across Earth colonies, the footage ignited reaction, not just from civilians, but from Zenobio experts, ethicists, and military analysts. Questions rose faster than diplomatic channels could contain them. Why were living beings left in lethal conditions without effort to recover? What classified them as expendable? And why did it take a single human technician, unsupported and unauthorized, to prove their survival possible? Public pressure mounted. Earth's Bioethics Commission convened an emergency review. Allied species from neighboring coalitions issued joint statements urging an inquiry into Tharxie biological management practices. Interstellar forums overflowed with comparisons between human resilience and Tharxie cold efficiency. The narrative was no longer technical, it was moral. Morgan wasn't part of the conversations directly, but she felt the effect. Her quarters, once restricted, were now frequently visited by observers, both human and Tharxie. She said little. The twins said more through their behavior than she ever could. They no longer hid. They moved freely, alert and responsive. One perched often behind her shoulders, the other curled at her feet. When unknown faces entered, they positioned themselves between her and the newcomers. Protective. Intentional. Sentient. A visiting Earth biologist recorded their interactions quietly, then turned to her afterward. You didn't imprint them. They did it themselves. Morgan nodded. They decided. No one here seems ready to admit that. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Eventually, the tribunal concluded its deliberation. The ruling was delivered with ceremonial restraint. She would not be punished. Her override would be formally recognized as an ethical exception under human moral code, but not under Tharksy logic doctrine. The dragons would remain in her care, temporarily, under a joint custody designation pending further evaluation. It wasn't victory. But it was a shift. Within days, a new Tharksy delegation arrived from Central Command. Not judicial. Scientific. Their presence changed the atmosphere. They weren't interested in punishment. They were interested in understanding why the impossible had occurred. They studied the twins under controlled, distant observation. And for the first time, they asked Morgan direct questions, clinical, specific. What did you do during their initial hypothermic state? What did they do when exposed to your voice patterns? Do you believe they registered agency? She answered with detail, not rhetoric. They responded to contact. They tracked tone. They made uncoerced decisions to approach. No resistance followed. Just recording. Eventually, one Tharksy researcher stayed behind after the others left. He examined the dragons silently. Then, without directive, offered a statement. Your species may perceive value faster than we calculated. She watched him go without comment. That acknowledgement meant more than the ruling. In the following week, Morgan was given provisional clearance to return to select labs under human supervision. The twins accompanied her, unstressed, confident. They began mimicking new behaviors. When presented with puzzles, they learned to manipulate simple objects. They responded to environmental triggers with adaptive reactions, not instinctive flinches. Tharksy algorithms tracked it all. Slowly, the data began to prove what intuition had already known. These weren't failed experiments. They were intelligent, responsive lifeforms capable of choice and memory. A request was filed by Earth Command, full species reclassification. It triggered tension. Tharksy protocol required centuries of data to assign sentience levels. Earth, by contrast, needed proof of agency and adaptability. The clash was philosophical as much as political. Amid these debates, the dragons continued to grow. Their scales deepened in color, now shimmering with iridescent green-blue patterns under lab light. Vocalization patterns emerged, short sequences with tonal variation. Not mimicry. Communication. Morgan logged every shift with careful neutrality. But privately, she started using names. The larger one, quick to act, protective, she called Caro. The smaller, methodical, observant, became Soul. They responded to those names. They came when called. They chose when to interact and when to remain apart. Weeks passed. When Tharksy delegates returned with reclassification denials, citing insufficient generational observation, Morgan presented a counterlog, 23 distinct learning behaviors in less than 2 weeks. Multiple stress adaptations. Cooperative decision-making. Individual identity emergence. You can keep waiting for data, she said. Or you can acknowledge what's already standing in front of you. No direct reply came. But the next day, the denial order was paused. Let me know when you're ready for Section 5, F, or if you'd like a trailer-style recap, F, alongside it. The reclassification pause triggered a quiet fracture within the joint oversight structure. Human scientists began opening parallel case studies without waiting for full Tharksy consensus. Across 3 colonies, Earth-aligned labs requested samples and behavioral access to Caro and Soul. Requests were denied. Morgan declined politely but firmly. They weren't data points. They were individuals, and individuals didn't get handed off like objects. As their recognition spread, pressure mounted from both sides. Tharksy factions splintered. A younger cohort of xenobiologists argued for adaptive protocols, citing emerging intelligence patterns from the twins as proof of agency. The traditionalist core rejected the premise entirely. In their logic schema, intelligence wasn't just action, it was pre-coded legacy. These creatures, born from manipulated genomes, had no line of proven cognitive evolution. To the elders, that meant they couldn't be classified as anything more than refined tools. Morgan wasn't debating theories anymore. She was managing survival. Daily threats, subtle and overt, appeared in her internal calms. reassignment requests, transfer orders, quiet hints that maybe the pressure would ease if she stepped away. She ignored them all. Because each time she opened the cradle in the morning, Sol greeted her with a soft hum, and Caro hovered near the door, listening for movement. They'd begun creating vocal sequences no one had taught them, signals between each other, adjustments in tone when humans entered the room. Even Earth specialists started backing off protocol. Their reports used words like language development, pre-symbolic exchange, and interspecies empathy. They stopped calling them specimens. They used names now. A turning point came when the Central Research Directorate called for a full independent review. But not for the dragons, for the program that created them. Lab 3X9, where the twins had been engineered, was exposed for cutting cycle tolerances and preemptively declaring low performers as failures to justify budget cycles. The death toll was higher than previously known. Over 80 genetically altered neonates, frozen within hours of birth, declared unviable without proper postnatal observation. That audit report leaked. Public response was instant and ferocious. What followed wasn't a debate. It was a reckoning. Earth issued a moratorium on all genetic disposal protocols across allied projects. The Tharxi responded by withdrawing key personnel from joint posts, citing irreconcilable doctrine divergence. But the damage was done. The precedent had shifted. Morgan watched as the twins navigated this shift without knowing they were its cause. Sol had started gliding short distances, using her widened shoulder flaps. Caro had grown bolder, now choosing when to be alone and when to approach. They had learned more in 3 weeks than many considered possible in a year. And they trusted her, not out of conditioning, but because they remembered who held them when no one else would. The moment that changed everything wasn't dramatic. No press. No tribunal. It was a routine visitation, 2 Tharxi envoys entering with translators and neuroreaders to assess behavioral patterns. As they began standard tests, Sol chirped, looked directly at one of them, and repeated back a short greeting it had used earlier. Not in mimicry. In context. The Tharxi froze. Replayed the audio. Matched cadence. Verified tone. Then Caro nudged the scanner panel and sat still, presenting a limb for scanning without instruction. Voluntary compliance. Uncoached. The elder envoy stepped forward, observed silently, then spoke to Morgan in deliberate common. They are not assets. They are aware. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. 2 days later, the reclassification request was approved. Not just for the twins, but for any surviving experimental species that demonstrated autonomous behavior, problem-solving, or bonding capability. They would be protected under emerging sentient rights law. It would take years to build that framework, but the door had opened. Morgan was granted full protective stewardship. The cradle was decommissioned and replaced with open habitat integration. Caro and Sol now slept freely near her quarters, curled together in a beam of filtered solar light. When she left for brief work assignments, they waited near the doorway. When she returned, they ran to her. They had no need for commands. They needed presence. The Tharxi never apologized. But they also never interfered again. Morgan's log entry, the day of the ruling, was brief. * they were never forgotten. That's why they lived. *. And somewhere across 100 listening stations and shared colonies, the message echoed through tight channels and open streams alike. Humanity didn't save them because it was safe. Humanity saved them because it was right. Let me know if you'd like a summary version, F, for narration or a closing credits script, F, to match.